You're listening to OK Podcast, a podcast by Sean Perrin about Radiohead.
About Radiohead. About Radiohead. About Radiohead. About Radiohead. About Radiohead. About Radiohead.
Hi, I'm Sean Perrin, host of OK Podcast, the show where I dive deep into the musical and cultural impact of the world's greatest band, Radiohead. Most fans would agree that OK Computer and Beyond probably represents Radiohead's best work. But have you stopped to consider why this is from a musical perspective? Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Brad Osborn. He wrote a book called Everything in Its Right Place, Analyzing Radiohead, which dives deep into this subject. We discuss the band's creative use of song forms, musical timbres, and, most interestingly, how they combine these elements in ways that push boundaries but never quite break them. We also reach an amazing realization about why Lift may not have made it onto OK Computer. Show notes for today's episode can be found at okpodcast.com/2. Today's episode of OK Podcast is brought to you in part by D'Addario. D'Addario makes some of the world's finest instrument strings and musical accessories right here in the USA. They're committed to sustainability as part of their business practice through the Playback program, which is a string recycling program that has recycled over 1 million sets of strings to date. For more information about this program and how you can help them reach their goal of 2.5 million sets of recycled strings in 2018, see D'Addario.com/playback. If you need a new set of strings for your guitar, you can pick up a set of D'Addario strings right now at okpodcast.com/strings. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy the show. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about your musical past, because although a lot of people really love Radiohead, myself included, I think there's a little bit more involvement on your behalf simply for the sake that you not only teach graduate courses on the subject, but literally have written a book about it. So if you could tell me a little bit about just your musical upbringing in a nutshell, where you first encountered Radiohead, and how your passion has exploded to this incredible level.
Yeah, well, I have to thank my mother, of course, for making me take piano lessons even when I didn't want to as a child. So that led to me being a band dork, and I played trombone in band. But it really wasn't until my friend got a drum set and started inviting me over to bang on his drums, ineloquently, I should add, at first, that I fell in love with rock music and really wasn't that into Radiohead, to be honest. When I was in high school, I was more into punk rock and thought that Radiohead was actually too cerebral. It wasn't until Kid A came out, when in fact it got really cerebral, that I actually started liking it. My same friend who had the drum set in high school and let me bang on it, let me borrow a copy of Kid A in 2000. And basically I fell in love from that moment onward. Also, there's something about being in your early 20s when you want to take yourself way too seriously. So I was sort of getting out of punk rock at that point and really liked the idea of myself as a sort of music intellectual, I guess.
Yeah, I think I felt a little bit that way too when I was in music, doing my music degree. And I find that's a strange time because I was more easily able to fall in love with new music back then. I have to try a little harder now. Do you find that too?
Oh, absolutely. I really long for the time when I was in my 20s and just spent all day listening to music. And now it's, I stay up with new albums that come out, but it's hard for me to listen to a new album, 20 times on repeat like I used to, lying on the floor with headphones.
Well, it's funny because I was in high school in the early thousands, just as Kid A and Amnesiac and all those albums were coming out. And I realized today that the music I was listening to then is almost as old as the so-called classic rock that I thought was so kind of hip when I was in high school. So it's no wonder that kids today have sort of a more difficult time getting into Radiohead or even experiencing bands like Radiohead. It's literally sort of like classic 90s era music now.
Right. And just like 10 years ago, I don't know, companies like Target were selling Led Zeppelin and AC/DC t-shirts to junior high kids. Now they've actually started selling Radiohead and Nirvana t-shirts.
You're kidding? They've got Radiohead shirts at Target now?
It's true. It's like the oldies for millennials.
So funny because we had Target in Canada for a couple of years, but it shut down, and now I wish they'd come back. So you know what? Let's dive right into the music here, because honestly, I feel like I could probably talk to you all day about the really, really intricate book you've written called Everything in Its Right Place, Analyzing Radiohead. You have went very deep into the subject, and I first of all just want to thank you for this effort, because I think it's important, and I think that it's important that the music of Radiohead gets captured and discussed in an intellectual setting.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I have a story for you. When I was in university, my teachers, or one of them in specific, who I won't name here, told me I should quit music because I was more passionate about bands like Radiohead and the Matthew Good Band than I was about Bach at the time.
Oh,
What does
wow.
that comment mean to you, or how would you have interpreted that?
Well, not to offend your unnamed teacher, but I just think that way of bifurcating the classical from the popular is really outdated. You probably know this, but next week there's the premiere of a Brahms First Symphony and Radiohead's OK Computer mashup happening in Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is the way that the way of the future in music, that we're just constantly seeing a blurring of the lines between the popular and the classical.
Well, and I've found that in the same way that Bach might be interesting from its own perspective, and I do love Bach, let's not be wrong about that, but I find that Radiohead is interesting in the perspective, or from the perspective of song form, use of timbre, instrumental innovation, and those are all things that you captured in your book. So I think that, part of me wants to take this book to my old professor and say, hey, look at this. There's
Right,
something to it.
Exactly. It's not that all the things that are in Bach are also in Radiohead, but I think that there are as many really interesting things in Radiohead's music as there are really interesting things in Bach's music.
Well, I think this is a product of our time, is that, I just had Warren Lane on the podcast, who did ethnomusicology for a degree, and we're now recognizing the value of not only other cultures, but styles. And I don't think that's something that was happening in the, last century.
Right. Or if it was the provenance of ethnomusicology professors and musicology professors, and sort of music theorists, tended to stay away from that because you need a whole different toolkit to analyze music from different cultures like that. But now we see music theorists forming interest groups and even conferences around the analysis of world music.
Absolutely. So for someone who's unfamiliar with songwriting, I imagine there's many, many people who listen to Radiohead but don't actually write songs. Let's just quickly go over the 3 or 4 types of sections within songs that we might encounter throughout your book. We've got the verse, bridge, chorus. Would you quickly just explain each of those sections and how we can objectively tell them apart?
Sure. So like a really standard rock song form in this day and age consists of alternating verses and choruses. And the way to tell those sections apart from each other is that choruses traditionally have the same lyrics every time they come back, whereas verses have the same music but different lyrics. So, for example, the chorus in Karma Police, "This is what you'll get," is the same time both times it comes back. But the verse, with the Hitler hairdo and all of that stuff, the lyrics are different in both of the verses.
I once heard that verses are kind of like telling the story and choruses are more what you sing in the shower. What do you think about that?
I love that. I mean, from a more sober perspective, I would say that the verses advance the storyline and the choruses reflect on it. But I like the idea of singing the shower.
Almost like an Explain Like I'm 5 version. So
yeah.
There you go. So basically the verses are something where the lyrics change, and that's the part that tells the story. The choruses are more melodic and more repetitive, I guess, and I guess you could sing them in the shower. What is the bridge?
The bridge is usually traditionally just a way to, dare I say, kill time between chorus 2 and either chorus 3 or chorus 2 and a separate verse chorus at the end. They are not a standalone part of the song. You wouldn't sing the bridge in the shower. They're just like a connective tissue or literally a bridge, from one part of town to another part of town.
Yeah, bridges connect places. And so
Yeah.
what are some other sections which can appear in songs but don't have to or don't always or more
Right.
rare?
So now we can dive into like what Radiohead actually does, which is pretty remarkable. Instead of closing a song with a chorus, which is kind of standard practice, sometimes they'll close a song with a brand new section at the end. And this is what I call in the book a terminal climax. So back to Karma Police, the ending. For a minute there, I lost myself. It's morning here. That was a bit low. That's not the chorus. That's in fact a brand new section that only appears at the end of the song. So it's terminal climax, right? Terminal at the end of the song, and climax. It is the most memorable part of the song, actually usurping the chorus.
One thing I loved about your book was how you talked about something very interesting, actually, is that Karma Police, for the chorus, actually subdues the instrumentation and energy a little bit, which is a little bit odd.
Yeah,
and it opens the door. Yeah, it opens the door to that terminal climax because it's almost the choruses themselves are somewhat unfulfilling in that way.
Right, that's exactly right. In most terminally climactic songs, the terminal climax is fulfilling a role left unfulfilled by the chorus. And I think you're exactly right about that, the way that the volume goes down in Karma Police for the chorus.
So you mentioned a couple other chapters too. You're a little later in the book. You're talking about an analysis of all the albums and the different song forms on the different albums. And it's really interesting to me because one other thing you talk about is how, as Radiohead makes the song forms more complex, the instrumentation or the timbre or other elements of the music become less complex and more approachable, or vice versa. For example, Kid A, ironically, with its stark sort of ice agey feeling atmosphere that's very isolated, the song forms are some of the most basic in all of their music. So what do you call this, and how do you think about it?
So the song forms in Kid A actually date even farther back. I talked about verse-chorus forms as being the norm in today's music, but before the verse-chorus, we had what's called a strophic form in the 50s and early 60s, where instead of A, B, A, B, verse-chorus, you just have A, and we see a lot of forms on Kid A doing that. Now, the reason that they do that, whether consciously or not, is because we as listeners have only so much perceptual energy to give to a song. If they were to overload us by giving us those weird Ice Age timbres and also weird forms, we'd be so overwhelmed that we might actually stop listening. So this is why Radiohead's actually been so popular commercially. They're interesting from a critical perspective, of course, but they never give you too much information, and that, I think, allows their music to be appreciated by millions of people. Like I said, if Kid A had gone another way with complex song forms and complex timbres, I don't think it would have been as commercially successful. It would have been a sort of information overload.
Well, and I've encountered this with electroacoustic music, for example, which I think has some incredible potential, but as a genre has almost no listenability at all.
Right, and this is also what's true of both the indeterminacy genre of the 1960s and also total serialism of the 1960s, which, despite having completely opposite compositional means, one of those is composed music by chance, the other is composed music by intricate systems. They were both so full of dense information with no repetition that, they both kind of failed, actually.
Yeah, and for listeners, I think the archetypal example of the repetition and improvisational composition he's discussing is a piece called In C, and basically there's just 52 blocks of music, and you have a little bit of rules to move through them, but there's not really any direction of the piece. It's very random, and although it's wonderful and gorgeous, it's not something you want to exactly throw in the car unless you're me.
Right.
So before we move on from Karma Police, I want to talk about that terminally climactic section a little bit there, because sometimes there's another section in songs used called the pre-chorus. So how can we determine, or is it possible to determine, does it need to be determined, that those sections are actually the chorus and not functioning as a pre-chorus, which leads to the final chorus, which is only played once? Right.
So there is a really similar form that you're sort of bringing up, which I call a retrospective pre-chorus. So if, let's say, you have a pre-chorus, and instead of going to a chorus, it goes back to a verse. Then you hear the pre-chorus again, and then this time it goes to the chorus. So now we have a form that goes A, B, A, B, C. Now that form, A, B, A, B, C, looks abstractly exactly like Karma Police form. The difference is when we truly have the retrospective pre-chorus, all of the examples I know of play a second chorus. So that would go A, B, A, B, C, A, B, C. An example of that retrospective pre-chorus form is used all the time by the band Coheed and Cambria.
Mm. So, for example, with Radiohead, I mean, are there any songs that they do with this that they tend to avoid the chorus for some reason?
They do. So I don't know of any retrospective pre-chorus forms in Radiohead because they do shy away from excessive repetition of choruses. So they wouldn't, for example, go back and play that chorus a second time. They'd only play it once, which makes it a terminal climax. Just a side note, from listening to Radiohead so much, I've become quite allergic to choruses, in fact. My wife will attest to this. If a band on the radio plays a third chorus, I go for the volume knob and do a slow fade out.
Yeah, I find the same thing, even with music that I really enjoy, like Depeche Mode or Yes or High and Dry.
Right, High and Dry, third chorus,
yeah, exactly. So do you think that this song form, or this sort of brilliant, you call it the Goldilocks zone, I believe, in your book, sort of pushing the envelope just to the right point, But do you think that's the true brilliance of Radiohead?
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned High and Dry, which has a third chorus. This is, of course, before, how to say it nicely? I think before the band really figured out this Goldilocks zone. So having that third chorus in High and Dry is just too much repetition. It spoon feeds you the song form, but on your fifth hearing, it's boring. So they really hit that Goldilocks zone from OK Computer afterwards. And don't quote me on this, but I don't think there's a third chorus after 1997. I think that they realized at that point that the listener really only needs two.
Does Lift have one? It may have been their last attempt at a third chorus, but I'll have to double check.
Okay. Well, it didn't make it. It was left on the cutting room floor.
Exactly.
So.
I've noticed that I'm actually more compelled by form and production than I am by artists. I don't know if this is something you experience, but for example, I once thought for a short time that maybe I was actually a Nigel Godrich fan and not a Radiohead fan, because everything he touches turns to gold, and even artists like Elliott Smith who write extremely compelling song forms. That is what I really enjoy. What do you make of that? And have you also checked out a lot of Nigel Godrich's other works, and do you believe his impact on the band is so extremely important as I do?
Well, I mean, yes, to your last question. But what are some other things that you like that Godrich has worked on?
Warpaint, Air, for example.
Okay.
Not all of Air, but they have one album called Talkie Walkie, which to me always stuck out in their catalog as being really interesting. And it wasn't until I started looking at other albums that Godrich has produced that I was like, oh, that one. I think he did Beck Sea Change as well.
Oh, interesting. So do those two albums sound like Radiohead-esque to you?
There's a section in Warpaint, their title album, their first album, that actually sounds almost exactly like Climbing Up the Walls, unfortunately.
Oh, weird.
But the production elements, the song form, the syncopation, the jilted intros that sort of skip over themselves before they start the song. You talk about that sort of backbeat shifting in the book. Yeah, a lot of really interesting stuff. I don't know if you've checked out Warpaint, but if you haven't, you've got some good music ahead of you.
Yeah, now it's on my list. That's cool. I'm not the first person to point out the sort of parallel between Nigel Godrich's role with Radiohead and George Martin's role with the Beatles. I think that he is a truly intricate part of the band from 97 onward.
Do you think that Nigel Godrich has an effect on the song form? For example, there's a show, I can't remember which venue, but the show where the instrument used to play the organ on motion picture soundtrack, that broke at a concert. And then afterwards they busted out Creep. And Tom made some comment, which I've always found a little bit cryptic before he played that. He said something like, here's a newer song or older, I can't remember which. And it implied that motion picture soundtrack may have been written before Creep. And older versions of motion picture soundtrack actually do have a second chorus.
Oh, wow.
So do you think that Godrich, not to mention Nude, I don't know if you've heard early versions of Nude, but 2, sometimes 3 choruses and definitely extra verses in there. So do you think that Godrich plays an integral role in finding this Goldilocks point?
That really is interesting to know. I mean, the band is pretty cagey about their studio experiences, but they are remarkable for having such a long gestation period for some of these songs. Like early versions of Reckoner that sounded nothing like what we heard on Rainbows, and of course you mentioned Nude. I would like to think that maybe Godrich makes them more concise and perhaps pushes them to completely change the instrumentation. For example, Reckoner and most recently True Love Waits. Just completely different instrumentations. Maybe I can see Godrich in the studio being like, yeah, you've played this one on tour a lot, but what if we completely reimagine it as a ballad or something?
Well, which was the first album that Godrich did? Was it the Bends with them?
I thought it was OK Computer.
I think it might be OK Computer as well. So, and that's again sort of what might be pushing me towards my theory is that I wonder if as a band they need that sort of focus in the studio from a producer. And I wonder too, I was reading your book and I know that it starts at OK Computer for obvious reasons of, the compelling songwriting and all these things, but how do you view their Pablo Honey and Ben's era music?
Well, I think that they are really just pieces of the genres they were working in, namely, they're Britpop albums, they're almost a little grunge albums, and I've made the rather unpopular claim that Pablo Honey could have been written by Oasis or Blur. But I stick with it. I think that well, it's a smart business move if you're trying to make it into a flooded scene such as late grunge and Britpop in the early 90s. It's a smart business move to sort of stick with what the popular public really wants and really knows. And I think that there's a commercial aspect to this too, that they only had enough money to really do what they really wanted to do after those two albums.
Yeah, I would agree, but I also, in a way, I think this is sort of a point which we might disagree on, but I view the Pablo Honey and the Benz era as sort of when they perfected the songwriting craft, and I'm not sure that the other eras could have come without it. So I don't know. Although it's easy to discount it, I really see a place for it, and I also think that it's, in a way, one of the most brilliant things they did was open up with a single that had the power and energy and longevity. And it was so good, it was almost a one-hit wonder for Creep, because that just exploded them onto the stage. There's few bands now that have done that and then managed to innovate in the way that they have. So I wonder if it wasn't the smartest move they could have made to start off where they did and then change.
Yeah, I mean, of course, history could have gone a really different way if, for example, a very similar thing happened with Nirvana if they came out with Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Yeah.
And then that propelled them to such a point where they could have kept innovating for years and years and years. But of course, we didn't get to find out the answer to that question. I think you're right. And I think that I tend to make too much of a black and white line between, on the one hand, the Benz and Pablo Honey, and then like sharp divide, brand new band, OK Computer. I think there's a lot of threads of continuity you can hear, especially between the Benz and OK Computer. I mean, Let Down and Airbag, to me, are like great rock songs that very well could have been on the Benz. Well,
and I heard that, I think it might have been High and Dry was supposed to be included on Pablo Honey. But it wasn't. So I think there's a lot of songs that, interestingly enough, like True Love Waits, look at that one. It matured over about 10, 12 years and longer even, and didn't really appear as a studio version for many, many albums. But it's funny because of the place people choose to draw the line. Like for me, before I read your book, I think you convinced me of otherwise, to be honest. But I used to draw the line at Kid A. I used to see a pre-Kid A and a post-Kid A Radiohead. And I saw OK Computer as sort of the pinnacle of their sort of rock style. And then everything after that has been just a little bit out of the water, except for In Rainbows. But anyways, go ahead.
Well, let's make the comparison then back to the Beatles. How do you feel about Sgt. Pepper's and the White Album? So which one is the culmination of their sort of like jangly pop songwriting, and which one is like the truly revolutionary one?
Yeah, in that case, it's funny that you mentioned that, because it makes me think about, of course, Radiohead again. But I wonder, how do these bands change their sound so much? Because as a musician, I've experimented with songwriting, and not to dodge your question, but this comes to mind. I have trouble finding one sound. So how does a band like the Beatles or Radiohead reinvent themselves to the point that it's not even sure where the biggest reinvention took place? Right. I guess for me, I would consider the White Album though to be the biggest shift. Yeah.
So to me, that we agree that Kid A is the White Album and OK Computer is Sgt. Pepper's. Yeah. Yeah. So your question about because we're both songwriters, you have to think of songwriting totally differently when you have a multi-million-dollar enterprise behind it. You have to play your cards maybe a little more carefully. So you and I can completely reinvent ourselves from album to album, and if we sell 64 copies instead of 42 copies, like, good job. But a band like Radiohead, if they completely reinvent themselves, which they totally did on Kid A, they stood to lose just untold millions of dollars from that little experiment,
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder what compelled them to go that direction. It doesn't seem like it was an obvious choice at all.
No, but they made so much money on OK Computer that they could afford to make a big gamble, let's say.
So before we move on from song form, because I feel like actually this episode could be sort of focused on song form, if that's okay. It's the one thing that I find most compelling about their work. At this point, I guess it's because I'm currently writing some songs, and I've noticed how playing with the form is the most compelling thing I can do at this stage of the writing. But I had a question about Kid A in particular, because one thing that you do mention with the terminally climactic form from Karma Police is that it introduces a new section at the end. So, and I fully agree about Karma Police, but one thing I found surprising was, although the forms are generally more straightforward on Kid A, in your book you mentioned that there's 0% of the songs have a terminally climactic form on Kid A. So what do you make of the section, for example, at the end of How to Disappear Completely, which I believe there's a new chord introduced even, but it's that sort of long, extended, melismatic section. And also motion picture soundtrack, the I Will See You in the Next Life bit. Are those just kind of more outro sections, or how do you think about those?
That's a really good question. And those are both really accurate, I think, observations about those two sections of the song form. They're also really close readings. So I'll start with How to Disappear Completely. The chord that's introduced at the end is an E major chord. And it's like 4 minutes in. It's like one new chord. But then it does go right back to the same F sharp minor, A, D progression that we've heard the whole song. Yes. So I'm not sure that one E chord constitutes in itself its own section. If you read the chapter on harmony, what it actually does is the piece has been sort of
what do you call that? False tonic or something? I can't remember the term you used.
It's an absent tonic.
Absent tonic.
In this case, this is an odd case because you actually have the tonic chord A major, but you don't have the dominant chord E to sort of seal the deal or cement the A tonic. You finally get the E dominant chord 4.5 minutes or something into the song, which is just a truly remarkable tonal journey that they take us on. But I don't think it's a new section because, again, afterwards it goes back to something that we've heard before. Now, the other one you brought up in Motion Picture Soundtrack does not go back to the music we've heard before. So that section, I will see you, that one does also start on a new chord and continues with a bunch of new chords. In fact, a really shocking, we're in the key of G major, and we get a really shocking C sharp half diminished 7 at the end. So I think with that song, I would call that section an outro. And the only difference between outro and terminal climax, or maybe I should say coda, because it is new material. The difference between coda and terminal climax has to do with the climax or memorability. That section is not, I would assert, the most memorable section of the song. It would definitely be either the chorus or the verse in Motion Picture Soundtrack.
Interesting. Because, when I was reading it, that was what I was thinking about. It's like, wait a minute, these songs seem to have the terminally climactic form, but maybe there's something I'm missing. And I have to say, I found your discussion about the harmony really fascinating. And I thought it was interesting, actually, because your concept of the absent tonic and the title, How to Disappear Completely, sort of gelled quite well together. Although I don't think that was the intent of the band. And that draws me to my next question, which is, to what extent do you think the band is aware of all this? I mean, Tom York famously cannot even read music. Johnny Greenwood is classically trained, but I don't know that they sit down and think about it in this way. So how does it come about, or what do you make of that?
I have to say that next to what is the meter of Pyramid Song, this is the question I get asked the most, is like, does the band actually know what they're doing? Does that matter? Structural theorists, people who work on literature, have sort of solved this problem for us earlier in the 20th century with a concept called the death of the author. So this is a big argument that we, in fact, shouldn't concern ourselves with what the author felt. Now, I'm not a French structuralist, so I like to think of it sort of more basically that Tom York is one person, and he thought one thing about how a song was made, but there are millions of listeners who have thought their own thing about what the song means. And I think it's more important to address, how millions of people might have understood a song than how Tom might have understood it. But if really you put my feet to the fire and make the answer to the question, does Tom know what he's doing with these sort of parallels between the lyrics and the song title and the absent tonic? No, is my answer. I'm sure that people like me and you who think way too hard about these things, we're the ones who come up with those interpretations and not the auteur, as it were.
So how do they arrive at these brilliant forms and concepts then? Because, like, for example, I was listening to another podcast yesterday, and the guy was talking about how, theoretically and physically, there's nothing preventing a beginner golfer from grabbing a golf club and immediately hitting a 300-yard drive to a hole-in-one. But the odds of that happening are very, very small, and the odds of repeating it are almost zero. So how does someone like Tom York hit, hole-in-one again and again with new golf clubs?
Well, I think we have to be careful with that, because if this person, Tom York, had never started a band called Radiohead and was still making songs in his Oxfordshire basement, the exact same songs, I don't think we'd find them as brilliant than if we're looking sort of in hindsight at this band who's been so critically acclaimed. And now we're all of a sudden actually looking for the brilliance. It sort of relates to the watchmaker argument about creation in a way. Not to compare Tom York to God too much, but
he recently did sign that meme, though, that someone put like the Kid A-Bear on a picture of Jesus. No, his face on a picture of Jesus, and he signed it. I think it was in Rio, but
Oh my
Anyways,
god.
that's super interesting though, because I think that you're right. I mean, once someone has reached a level of success, it gives us the ability to listen and critique and analyze. I mean, I don't think anyone's analyzing the songs that I've been writing in my basement. They might be great.
They
You
might
know?
be. That's another podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting for me because In Rainbows is actually, and this will be controversial, but it's actually probably one of my least favorite Radiohead albums.
Ooh, that is controversial.
Yeah, but upon reading your book, I realized something really interesting about it is that this, you're right, the song forms are the most bizarre. It's the Kid A of song forms in a way.
Right. Well, again, that really relates to the balance because timbrally, that album is a step backwards. They had so much experimentation with Kid A and Amnesiac in terms of new timbres, and to an extent, Hail to the Thief is where they start doing some really weird guitar effects with like the modified Stratocaster and EBO and all kinds of stuff. So on the 2007 record, I think they are taking a step back and playing more good old-fashioned guitar, drums, and bass music. And so to make that interesting, they then add a level of complexity to the song forms.
So it's odd because maybe In Rainbows is the real pinnacle of their sort of rock writing at this stage. And there was kind of a gap. I mean, I guess it makes me I felt guilty about it recently because I feel like it makes me a bad fan to appreciate that album less. But I was expecting, Hail to the Thief 2 or
I was too. Yeah, I was too.
I was really looking forward to that. And the live shows had implied something else, a different direction, which I was quite honestly enjoying. And then it came out and it was starkly different.
Yeah, I think that they have, they've put out these sort of nice rock and roll records almost exactly decades apart. It goes from OK Computer to In Rainbows. And I think A Moon-Shaped Pool really ignites a lot of that same spirit, the kind of basic rock and roll songs, which are also formally experimental in the same way that the 2007 record is. So again, it's stripped down instrumentation, kind of like guitar with a lot of strings from Johnny Greenwood on A Moon-Shaped Pool. But there are a lot of through composed and terminally climactic song forms on this new album.
Yeah, everything they've ever done is just really compelling, and I do appreciate all of it. But if it were me, my pinnacle is sort of the Kid A, Amnesiac sort of stuff. So, but one thing that I find interesting too, and I thought maybe you could shed some light on this, is they're so experimental with song form, timbre, all these different things that we've been talking about, harmony, voice leading, all kinds of stuff. Where are the songs that are like 20 minutes long, such as Yes has done? Where's the truly classical recapitulation and, movements, and where are these songs, and why is Paranoid Android the closest?
Well, you stole my thunder there. Yeah, I honestly think that Paranoid Android is the only one that does that. That's just not Radiohead's game. The long 7-minute, to 20-minute long songs, they just don't do it. And I think that has a lot to do with what I said earlier about balancing a perceptual debt to certain factors at one time. Honestly, with a song that's 20 minutes long, it's hard to balance perceptual attention to any one component. You're basically just trying to sit still long enough to hear it. Now, It sounds like you're the kind of person who has no problem listening to a 53-minute Terry Riley piece. But the majority of Radiohead's listeners, are used to that sort of 4.5-minute glass ceiling that's imposed on pop songs these days.
Are you familiar with Yes? Have you listened to much of them?
Oh, yeah. I wrote a dissertation on experimental song forms, and I had an advisor who was really into classic rock. Yeah. And I'm going to go ahead and say made me listen to a lot of Yes, a lot of Gentle Giant, a lot of stuff that wasn't even digitized, and he had to pull off of LPs for me.
Wow. I saw Yes recently, and it was absolutely unbelievable.
Wow.
But it's funny because songs of theirs like Heart of the Sunrise, which I think is about 9 minutes, and some others which are much longer, they don't seem that long, and I think it's because of their extremely artful use of recapitulation and bringing sections back.
That's a totally different kind of Goldilocks zone. If you can actually hold listener interest for that long, you've got to be doing something really interesting formally that's difficult to pull off.
We spent a lot of time talking about the terminally climactic form. We've kind of neglected some other ones, such as through composition. What is through composition in a nutshell?
Sure. Well, if we go back to the letter designations I used earlier, most of the song forms are, A, B, and we can stop there because already we've repeated a song section. So a through composed form just goes A, B, C, D, and nothing comes back. And And this is statistically rare in basically the entire corpus of music since at least the 19th century. So understandably, Radiohead does it less than they do than the terminal climactic forms. And this is because, again, there's too much debt to listeners' perception. If you just don't recapitulate any section, we as listeners sort of need to hear something twice to really remember it. And these through composed songs, they don't offer you that at all. Once you've really gotten to know a section, you're on to the next one.
And so what are some Radiohead songs that utilize this this technique or this form?
Well, to me, the most famous one is the opening track to Hail to the Thief, 2 + 2 = 5. So this is starts with an A section, are you such a dreamer? That's very quiet and in a very odd 7/8 meter. And then, around a minute 54, I believe, it turns into this Pearl Jam song with like rockin' 4/4 distorted guitars. Then it goes into a little bridge, do 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 do, and then the D section, and I try so hard, da 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 da, with this really kind of dissonant melodic stuff going on. So that's it, A B C D. That's the song form.
Yeah, and you're right. Nothing comes back, even though your ear wants it to.
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine a bridge section that came after that brought back the opening 7/8 groove in sort of a quiet moment where maybe Johnny Greenwood took a guitar solo or something. That would be kind of cool.
Yeah, it's funny. One thing you make me think about is when I was younger listening to Radiohead with no knowledge of song form or anything like this, and although I was playing music in like junior high school at the time, there was a time when I realized that I was sitting there listening to, I think it was a song like probably Idiotech or the National Anthem, as I did on repeat basically. And I just remember thinking like, Radiohead is so good, but there's songs, they just never really end. Like they don't really, I said to myself, like they don't really complete properly. I really wish that they would. And then I realized in that same instance, I was like, wait a second. It's because it makes me repeat it, that it is great. It makes me go back and do it again and again. I need to hear that moment again and again and again and again. I could listen to National Anthem literally 500 times in a row and never be bored.
Right. And this is just like a death sentence for a single on the radio, though. I mean, if you're trying to sell music on the radio, you want to repeat sections as many times as you can, and you want to bring about closure so the listener really knows, like, okay, the song's over.
Yeah.
But Radiohead wasn't going for that with tracks like the National Anthem. That was like not a hit single. So it does encourage the headphones on the floor style listening over and over again.
It's a hit single for me.
Yeah, right, exactly. And Idiotech's my favorite Radiohead song ever. So
really, wow, you're lucky because I wish. Well, a lot of people feel that way about Idiotech. They almost always play it live, so you're fortunate because you probably have always seen it live. Have you seen them live?
Yeah, I think 4 times. I saw them most recently on the Moonshaped Pool tour.
Which concert did you go to?
That was Kansas City.
Oh, nice. That was a great set list. I can't remember exactly what they played, but
they played Fake Plastic Trees, which is really remarkable.
Yeah, I saw the show in Seattle. They played Fake Plastic Trees, Twisted Words, Morning Bell, and Creep, I believe. It was an unbelievable set. Everything but National Anthem. So, I have 2 questions here, which are they're the same question, but framed differently, and I'm just really interested in your answer. Which song in the band's pre-OK Computer era do you think hinted most at what was to come in the future?
That's easy. Street Spirit, the closing track.
Okay, I agree.
Yeah, I think that they're so good at closing tracks. If you look at the closing tracks from every album, they always try something just a little bit different on the closing tracks. And this one, Street Spirit, was the first one to really start to overthrow the guitar with a little bit of keyboard. In other words, of course, the guitar was the dominant instrument in all of rock music. But for the first time in Street Spirit, those sort of breathy organ synth pads threatened to overtake the guitar. And that was, of course, what was to come later on Kid A.
And so, same question, but backwards. Which song in their current era, post-OK Computer, is most reminiscent of their past?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. Okay, so I already told you 2 songs on OK Computer that I felt like could have been on the Bends, but let's go more recent. Optimistic, maybe?
Oh, interesting.
I
would agree, actually.
Or I might be wrong. Both of which are kind of straight ahead 4/4 rock songs with a lot of guitar. And you know more about the sort of history of when these songs were composed, but I wouldn't be shocked if I learned that those 2 songs were actually composed in the OK Computer era.
Yeah, Nude actually is
Right.
Nude in its original form is one I was thinking of, because with the second chorus, and it sounds a lot more, earlier Radiohead, but in its current form, I don't think it is. I would have said Body Snatchers, actually.
Ooh, yeah. Boom, doom, 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 doom. Yeah, that's like such a 90s guitar riff. Yeah.
Yeah. So, no, those are all great answers. So here, let's throw a real curveball at it, at this question. What song is most representative of what their future might be?
Ooh, that's so good. I want to say Dex Dark or Desert Island Disc off of a Moonshaped Pool. They have these like sort of catchy programmed beats.
Yeah.
But then you have Tom's sort of introspective voice on top of them. And I think we see that combination in a lot of, dare I say, like top 40 pop right now. Not that Radiohead's going to go top 40 pop, but those two songs I think are, well, one of them was featured on a Netflix show, on that show Ozark. So that, if nothing, just like proves how, and of course Radiohead's all over Westworld, but this proves sort of like how of the moment that sort of sound can be. Man,
I sometimes don't give A Moonshaped Pool enough credit. That it's a really incredible album.
It's so good. I was ready not to like it, because
Me too.
Something about writing a book about like most of the records ended in 2011, and also like that 2011 record we haven't talked at all about, The King of Limbs, is such a weird one.
Very dense,
I was just thinking,
rhythmically.
Yeah, so dense. I was thinking like, where on earth do you go from here? And it's probably going to be bad. And then I fell in love with it, the day it came out, which was not true of The King of Limbs. It took me about 4 months to like that record.
Yeah, King of Limbs is such an awkward sort of brother to the other albums, but it does have its place. I'm just not sure it's a huge place in their history.
Yeah, it's the two drummer record. I think they had recently acquired a second drummer, and I think the whole record is about how to make such layered two percussionist textures.
For anyone who doesn't understand why Radiohead had to include a second drummer. Your book actually kind of explains this, not directly, but indirectly. Would you explain it for the audience real quick, why they had to do this as far as like the polyrhythms and the different times that are happening at the same moment? And is that the conclusion you reached? Yeah.
I'm not sure about the chicken or egg in this, though, that they include a lot of polyrhythms on that record, either because they had two drummers who could all of a sudden play in two totally separate meters, or if in fact their goal was to include those sort of polyrhythms, and so they got a second drummer. But
I know the answer to this, actually.
Do you? Tell me.
Yes. So apparently Clive Deemer, who's the drummer from Portishead, got a call from Radiohead after they recorded The King of Limbs, and they said, we want to tour this stuff, but we need someone else to play the second drum part because the textures are too rich.
Oh, that's so cool.
So Clive got together with Phil, and they learned the songs and went on tour.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah, because they had to put together, like, on the surface, it doesn't even sound, it sounds just crazy on the surface. You're like, why couldn't one drummer play this? Well, it's because there's like 4 time signatures going on at the same moment. Like, and Johnny Greenwood's even sitting on the front of the stage whacking on a drum during Bloom. Like,
yeah.
So yeah, they literally, the album came out, and they had all these bizarre sort of percussion textures going on, and there was no way to reproduce them live without adding a second drum kit and even a third.
Wow, that's such a good insight.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And, I feel that there was a hint at this during the 2008 tour when they would play that god-awful song, Bangers and Mash, that would just, sorry to be blunt, but I guess I was on that tour, and every time that song came up, I was like, oh my God, there's so many others I'd rather hear. But they had, Johnny and Tom both at the front on drums as well for a bit of the song. And it was really weird to watch.
Well, they did that also with live versions of They're There, where you had Ed O'Brien and I think Johnny both on these like huge, almost like Japanese taiko drums banging out. But those weren't polyrhythmic songs. I mean, that's just them adding a different layer. It's all still in 1 meter. Mm-hmm. I think for listeners who are interested in trying to decipher, as it were, these polymeters, I would suggest watching the From the Basement sessions, where you can really watch Clive and Phil interact and see who's playing what part, and kind of then I think that visual cue helps you see how the two time signatures kind of go together. Okay.
So we got a few listener questions here. Thank you so much to Kristen Lee for sending these in from Facebook. And there were some others from some other people, but they actually are sort of duplicated here. So I'm going to mainly focus on this list. So the first question that we didn't already answer, because a few of them we did, is who do you think influences Radiohead today musically?
Wow. So you've got to talk about the different influences on Tom and on Johnny, I think.
Yeah.
And they're both nothing current. I can't think of anyone who's making music now who's really influencing either of them. But of course, you've got Tom's noted influence from such electronic artists as Aphex Twin, and Johnny Greenwood's obsession, as it were, with the French composer Olivier Messiaen, and also, for example, the composer of the Threnody, Krzysztof Penderecki.
So her second question is, do you plan on publishing more about Radiohead?
Whew.
Or any
Let me
band
tell you
in
what
general?
it's like. Yeah, I mean, what it's like really living with a band for 4 years and writing about it. I need a bit of a Radiohead break. I'm currently working on a book on 90s music videos. Of course, Radiohead has a big part to tell in that story, but most of the music is decidedly more simple. And of course, I'm dealing with a lot of other genres such as hip hop in the 90s.
Her other question kind of interests me too, because you mentioned you had a lot of interesting times with the music of the band, but has the band given you any access, or the production team or any of their management given you any sort of insight or access to any of the members for your research?
This has been just such a dead end. I've tried so many times, so many different ways to get in contact with the band to try to ask questions. I have it on good authority that Johnny Greenwood got a copy of my book. I've just never got 100% confirmation from it. A friend of a friend of a friend is Paul Thomas Anderson's cameraman, and it was supposed to have been passed to Johnny at the Daydreaming video shoot.
Interesting. What was the first album that you purchased that influenced your musical tastes?
Ooh, the first album I purchased. I'm going to go ahead and say Pearl Jam's Versus, which is 1993, I think. Yeah, I distinctly remember sitting on a beanbag chair, listening to Versus and being like, oh my gosh, I need to get a guitar.
It's funny. I had that realization too many times that I wanted to play guitar, but it wasn't until the end of my degree, when I was kind of wrapping up my clarinet intensive study, that I did that. And I wish I'd done it a lot sooner, to be honest.
Yeah.
And it's funny. It's funny to come full circle, because I mentioned in the last episode that the first thing I did after I got my guitar in about 2009 was to watch some Warren music videos.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
those are so helpful.
Yeah, I learned Street Spirit from that, and
nice.
got me going. So last question from Kristen here. What bands do you think are following in Radiohead's footsteps? Like, what will the next Radiohead be?
Well, I thought for a long time that the Danish art rock band Mew, not to be confused with Muse, who I think sounds nothing like Radiohead, despite popular opinions to the contrary.
Oh, I want to give you a high five.
I mean, it's true that both of the lead singers kind of sing like violins with a lot of vibrato, but I think the comparison stops there. I think that Mew is doing a lot of the same kind of interesting things that Radiohead does. I think Bjork as well is doing the same sort of balancing of experimental and conventional as Radiohead. But these are all, of course, contemporaries of Radiohead. As far as new artists carrying the torch, I have to say, sadly, I haven't heard any. Maybe with a nod to Sun Lux. That guy seems to be doing some really interesting crossover music. You could also say, I guess, at large, a lot of these classical rock crossover artists like Max Richter, for example, or Spencer Krug might be carrying that torch.
It's so funny you say that, because I was wondering if the next sort of Radiohead will actually not be a rock band. Someone more like Hans Zimmer or someone like that, Who
just did a collaboration with Radiohead, of course.
Oh my God, that was, yeah. Well, you can't even imagine the moment of extreme pleasure that I realized when I saw that. I was like, oh my God, it's two of my favorites.
Yeah, I'm such a Blue Planet fan, and when I, of course, knew that they were going to do a separate version of Bloom for that, I watched the entire series all the way through, waiting for it, and I believe it's like the last 4 minutes of the last episode of Blue Planet 2 is when we finally get to hear the rearranged Bloom.
Oh God, I still haven't seen it. I need to. It's not on our Netflix yet in Canada, and I can't find it on Blu-ray. So I'll have to get to that really soon. But are they going to release like a soundtrack from that? I need it right now.
Oh yeah, I think I think they just did that one song though, right?
I know, but I need the soundtrack was still very good. But it would be great to have, and then sort of the culmination of that amazing Bloom arrangement at the end.
Yeah.
So, all All right, well, thank you so much. Let's move on to this lightning round here. There's just a couple quick questions I want to try and ask every guest just to get some interesting insight into the person I've been talking with, and sort of their musical insight. What are 3 other albums or bands that you think every Radiohead fan should check out?
3 other albums or bands. Mew Possessive S first 2 records, which are called Fringers and the Glass-Handed Kites. Those are great records that I think will spark a lot of Radiohead's interests. Other bands, if you don't know Bjork's entire catalog, get that.
Is there one more?
Oh, one more. Okay, one more. The first 2 Dirty Projectors albums, I think ending with Swing Low Magellan, I think are also doing some interesting kind of like art rock crossover. You know, that guy studied music at Yale, so some of those stuff's really interesting.
Oh, interesting. What is another passion outside of Radiohead that you have?
I'm actually mostly these days identifying as a rock climber and as an adventure cyclist.
Oh, very cool.
So I spend more time doing like outdoorsy stuff than playing music these days, so that's sort of my current passion. I live in Lawrence, Kansas, so it's a 5-hour drive to some really steep cliffs, which isn't ideal. But you know what I do live right next to is a lot of amazing gravel roads that get you way out in the country really quickly. So I love that for my bike.
What is something you do on a regular basis that you feel leads to your success generally?
I try to read a lot, actually, and I try to listen a lot. And I think that it's hard to be a music scholar without really knowing what's happening in music today. So every year when NPR puts out like 50 best records of the year, you know, I listen to all of them to really get a good sense of what's going on.
What is something surprising that you do that you think is unique amongst your friends?
Not worry too much about publishing. I think a lot of people in academia just stress out so much over getting stuff published. I tend to not worry about it and then have a fulfilling life in other ways. And what that does for me is when I do sit down to write, I'm so refreshed and energetic about it that I think I write about 4 times quicker than most people.
And the last question is there anything else you'd like to share with the OK Podcast audience?
Thank you for listening. And I think you've had a wonderful, wasn't Warren your first guest?
Yes, but the point that this airs, he will have been the first guest, yeah.
Such a wonderful first guest and such a wonderful introduction for people who want to sort of make this leap from like just playing guitar or just writing songs to like thinking really deeply about composition. I encourage listeners of this podcast to explore that middle space a little bit, sort of like Radiohead explores a nice middle space. You know, you don't need to go to music school to learn how to be a musician. You just need to watch videos by people like Warren and listen to podcasts like this. And I think your music will get more interesting.
Absolutely. And I definitely want to encourage everybody to check out Brad's book, Everything in Its Right Place, Analyzing Radiohead. You can find it on Amazon Canada and Amazon US. And I'll also put a link directly to this book in the show notes. And I think it's something every Radiohead fan should have on their shelf, their collection. And again, Brad, thank you so much for not only taking the time to speak with me today, but for writing this amazing insight into the band's music.
You're welcome. And thank you for starting this podcast. It's amazing.
Show notes for today's episode of the podcast can be found at okpodcast.com/2. If you're left wondering what a couple of those words meant today, like melismatic or recapitulation or anything like that, I'm putting together a list of glossary terms for each episode that links directly to a Wikipedia page to give you some information about what those terms might mean. Also, the show notes are really rather detailed, and I'm throwing up links to everything we talked about, and especially in this episode, a link to Brad's great book, Everything in Its Right Place. Speaking of this book, I want to congratulate winner Jordan L., who won my copy that I used to prepare for the interview and the interview sort of show notes that I used during the conversation. Future giveaways are going to be handled through the OK Podcast mailing list. I'm not quite sure how many there'll be. They're rather difficult to facilitate sometimes, but if I do have stuff and there's interest for it, I'd be happy to do some giveaways even on a relatively regular basis. So head to okpodcast.com and join the email newsletter, which you can do on the sidebar of any show notes page. If you have any suggestions at all for guests, or if you'd like to be a guest on the show yourself, send me a message at hello@okpodcast.com. You can also leave a voicemail directly on the website, which would be absolutely great to hear from you, just to say hi, where you are in the world, what you love about Radiohead, some other music you're into. I love to hear from everyone all over the place. It would be so great to have your voice in my inbox. In typical Radiohead style, OK Podcast is pay what you want. If you'd like to enjoy the free version, you can do this on Overcast or iTunes, wherever you happen to be listening, and please make sure to hit subscribe and leave a review on iTunes if you have a second. And if you'd prefer to get access to an ad-free version of the show, presented in high-resolution audio and more, head to okpodcast.com/gold. Don't forget to help D'Addario reach their goal of 2.5 million sets of recycled strings for 2018. You can learn more about this at d'addario.com/playback. If you need a new set of strings for your guitar, head to okpodcast.com/strings. I'm your host, Sean Perrin, signing off from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the podcast.